They were the first warriors of this land, before the flag, before the Constitution, before the very idea of the United States. They defended their people, their homes, their way of life. Then, in a twist of cruel irony, they were asked to fight for the very nation that took those things away. And they did, not once, not twice, but in every major war this country has ever known. This is not a story about war. It's a story about honor, about sacrifice, about Native Americans who bled for a country that tried to erase them. This is the story of America's forgotten warriors. When European settlers came, Native warriors resisted. They fought with valor in defense of their homelands, in wars now barely mentioned in classrooms. But as colonies became states and states became a nation, something surprising happened. Native Americans began serving in the US military. Some fought alongside colonial militias in the Revolutionary War, on both sides. Guess even back then, some people just wanted to make sure they covered all their bets. They were scouts, messengers, and guerrilla fighters. In the War of 1812, tribes again found themselves divided. Some sided with the US, others with Britain. But by the time of the Civil War, the situation grew even more complex. Take the Cherokee Nation, split in two. Some joined the Union Army, others the Confederacy. Thousands of Native men fought and died in a war that wasn't theirs to begin with. Why? Why would they fight? The reasons varied. Some saw it as survival. Others hoped that loyalty might earn respect, or at least protection for their tribes. Some were simply warriors, answering an ancestral call to defend something bigger than themselves. By the time World War I erupted in Europe, Native Americans were still not considered US citizens, and yet over 10,000 Native men volunteered to serve in the war. Let that sink in. They fought and died for a country that didn't recognize them as citizens, that still seized their land, that still sent their children to boarding schools to strip them of their identity. And still, they served. Among them were the Choctaw Code Talkers, the first of their kind. Using their native language to transmit battlefield messages, they confused German intelligence and helped American forces win critical victories. Their contribution? Classified, forgotten, until decades later. Kind of like a superhero origin story, except without the comic books. When the war ended, Congress finally granted Native Americans full US citizenship in 1924. But even then, many states denied them the right to vote. Still, they marched on. In World War II, over 44,000 Native Americans served. That's nearly 1 in 10 of all able-bodied Native men of military age. Per capita, Native enlistment was higher than any other group in the country. The most famous of these were the Navajo Code Talkers. They developed a code based on the Navajo language, one so complex it was never broken, not once. These young men, fluent in a language they were once punished for speaking in government schools, saved countless lives in battles across the Pacific. They were Marines. They were heroes. But when they returned home, they were told to keep silent. Their mission was classified, their voices muted. Secret agents without the fancy gadgets, just a really complex language and a whole lot of courage. For decades, few knew of their contribution. Their medals came late, their stories later still. But theirs wasn't the only sacrifice. Thousands of Native soldiers served in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. They fought in Normandy, in the Philippines, at Iwo Jima. and many never came home. Then came Vietnam. Once again, Native Americans enlisted in disproportionately high numbers. Some were drafted, many volunteered. To many young Native men, the warrior path still called. Some hoped to escape poverty. Others were driven by pride, duty, or legacy. But the war changed them, and not just on the battlefield. They returned to a country divided. Protests, disrespect, silence. One Native vet said coming home from Vietnam felt like showing up to a party you weren't invited to, and someone still asked you to clean up. For Native veterans, the return home was even harder. Reservation life hadn't improved. Jobs were scarce, healthcare worse. PTSD ran rampant. But help was hard to find. Traditional ceremonies were often the only form of healing they had. Some never fully returned. They became part of the long line of warriors who bore their scars in silence. From Desert Storm to Afghanistan, from Baghdad to Kabul, Native Americans continue to serve. And still, they serve at higher rates than almost any other ethnic group in America. The motivations are the same: honor, duty, family, identity. But now, many carry both a rifle and a burden, advocating for their people even as they wear the uniform of a government that often forgets them. Some joke that Native vets are the only people who can say, "I've served in the US Army, and I've also protested it." Many modern Native veterans return to their tribes and lead. They become protectors of culture, mentors for youth, defenders of land and water, warriors in every sense of the word. The battles don't always end when the war does. Native veterans face high rates of homelessness, unemployment, PTSD, and suicide. Access to mental health care and VA services is often worse in rural and reservation areas. But change is happening. Veteran groups rooted in Native traditions are forming. Healing lodges, sweat ceremonies, community drumming, and storytelling. Because sometimes the only medicine is memory and home. And maybe a good fry bread recipe doesn't hurt either. In 2020, a long overdue memorial rose in Washington, D.C. The National Native American Veterans Memorial, a sacred space for reflection, respect, and renewal. It honors warriors who served not for recognition, but for responsibility. Not because they were asked, but because their ancestors had always answered the call. Native Americans have worn the uniform of this country in every major conflict. They've walked into battlefields under a flag that once flew over their dispossession. And yet, they served with a strength rooted in something older than any nation: honor. That's not bitterness, that's courage. That's patriotism in its purest form. Because Native warriors didn't just fight for America. They helped shape it through sacrifice, bravery, and quiet resilience. And maybe that's what makes them truly unforgettable. To remember them is not to shame America. It's to honor it more completely, to see the full truth of its defenders, to recognize that this land was protected long before it was called the United States. Let their story remind us the nation is stronger, prouder, and more complete when it remembers all its warriors.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Native Historian. And as always, stay curious.